Good morning, sunshines. So today we're going to talk about fly systems. Our theater itself is a black box, so we don't particularly have a fly system in place, but we can create flying things in and out and that sort of thing. But at least for lighting is concerned, we have a catwalk that we can move various bars and things around. But about 70% of theaters you're going to find around the world, like the Davis Theater, like the Alabama Shakespeare Festival main stage, you're going to find theaters that have this thing called a fly system that's installed. Now, again, the fly systems came about with the Middle Ages when theaters moved inside during the Renaissance. You had sailors basically start rigging things in theaters the same way they rigged sails on ships. And so as we get to the 19th century and start introducing electrical lighting equipment, suddenly you have lighting that goes on the stage in addition to the lighting that had been on the front of the stage for years with gas and the candles. So once we get to electrical lighting, suddenly we start using those flying scenery devices that had been around for a couple of centuries that had been only used for flying drops and backdrops and legs and borders and things like that. Suddenly now we're starting to use them for our lighting positions. The stage has one of the problems with the hip systems that were originated was they inherently had to be out of balance. In order for they again use sand and sandbags to counterweight the battens. The battens are the pipes where the sails were hung and the scenery was hung. And what you would do is hang a lighting instrument on the batten, and then you would have some sort of counterweight on the other side, and you would have the pulleys that would lift and lower. And as you lifted the batten on stage, you had to lower the pulley system off stage, and vice versa. Now again, before the 20th century, when you were using hemp systems, what they were called, but they would use sandbags, you had to have it out of weight so that when you untied the rope, either the sand was heavier than the system on whatever you were flying over, the lighting equipment, that sort of thing, so it would move, or the lighting equipment had to be heavier so that it would overcome the friction in the pulleys, yes? One of the things that happens in the 20th century is we're able to add this counterweight system that is much more dependable, and that we add a purchase line that goes around the head block. Again, we'll show you pictures of this in a second. But above the stage is going to be this head block that takes all the pulleys and the rope and pulls it all the way around to the tension block below, and then back to this thing called an arbor, where you load counterweights. So that's the current way the system works. It's still the same idea with pulleys over the top. The loft blocks are what is above the stage that allows for now we have aircraft cable that goes from the top of the arbor. There's a very nice little picture there in your notes, so we can go give you a shot there of a bunch of aircraft cables on the top of what's called an arbor. And again, an arbor is just a device that carries the counterweights. And the whole reason for the counterweight is because we now, as opposed to being out of balance, in the current counterweight system, things are within 25 pounds, depending on how much a counterweight weighs. Again, here's a picture of a counterweight. At the Davis Theater, the counterweights are 35 pounds, and they also have half bricks, is what they're called, that weigh 20 pounds. And so you can get the weight within 20 or 35 pounds, which again doesn't necessarily run crazy when it's out of weight, but it at least will have a little movement. And again, you can get it balanced to where it totally doesn't move, and it's up to you pulling on the purchase line. The purchase line is sometimes called an operating line. It is also sometimes called a hand line. Different people call it different things. I'm gonna call it a purchase line. That's the way I was taught. Anyway, you'll see there's a little picture of a man standing there running a fly system with his hands on the purchase line. You'll see that they have a lock rail, which is where you run the fly system from. The lock rail has a series of locks on it so that when you get the pipe in position, or at trim is what it's called. Trim is where it sits. And again, that's determined by sight lines, depending on what the audience can see. And if you want the lights to be out of sight, you have to have the border in front of the lights so that the lights can just not be seen from the audience. And then you take a piece of tape and or a piece of fabric and run it through the purchase line. And then that'll be your trim line. A lot of people will put the line at the lock itself. I like to put a piece of tape at the lock and also at the top of the lock, so that when you lift the lock into place, there's a piece of tape at both places. Yes, that tells me I'm in trim. Again, with pieces of scenery, you'll get to trim when you hit the ground. So a lot of times that's a lot easier trim to hit. Again, when you're just off by hair, you're only talking about a ½ inch, an inch that the audience might be able to see or might not be able to see. And sometimes that is the height of a person. You know, if you're a 6-year-old, you see the lights. If you're a 40-year-old, you don't. So it depends on how high you sit in the seat as far as what your sight line is. Yes. So there's some counterweights. Again, above each of the line sets is this thing called a head block, and the head block, again, is a pulley system where you have all the cable from the top of the arbor that goes over the top of the head block, including the purchase line that goes around the head block. And again, in the diagram you see there, the purchase line goes around the head block, back to the arbor, and then from the bottom of the arbor through the tension block and back up to where you're running it as the person on at the lock rail. Again, that is the basic counterweight system. Again, here's some pictures from the Davis. There's one showing you what a lot of times we actually tour the Davis in this class, not this time. But you'll see what battens look like from above. You'll notice that the battens have this thing called a turnbuckle on them, so that when you are flying the batten, you can take that little piece of hardware, the turnbuckle, and you can turn it to level the batten. So it's a little bit of adjustment that can be made to each of the batten sizes, right and left and center. Usually for a 30-foot, 40-foot batten, you're going to have what are called 5 pick lines. Now, the weight that each pick line carries will vary depending on where it is in the system. It is not divided evenly. The middle pick line picks up about 1/3 of the weight of the entire line set. The outer 2 pick lines only pick up about 10% of the weight of the batten because they're so far out. The middle 2 of the 5 pick up about the other half of the weight. So you got about 30%, about 20% on 10% on either outsides, and about 1/4, 25% on the 2 pick lines in between. Yes. Again, you'll see there's a picture of what the line sets look like with the electrics hung on them on stage. You're talking about a couple of tons of weight per line set, and so you want to make sure that your line set is able to hold the amount of weight that you're putting on it. Line sets can be overweighted. Yes, and so one of the limits that they put on it is the size of the arbor. If you've only got an arbor that's about 6 foot tall, you can only put so many counterweights in it. But counterweights are also called bricks, and so a lot of times you'll hear people say load so many bricks. That's a counterweight. Yes, and so you want to make sure that you don't overload the system. There are ways of cheating that, but for the most part, the counterweight system, the arbor, will do the work for you. Again, here's another little diagram that shows you in a little bit more detail. You got not only do you have a lock rail at the bottom where you run the system from. Above in the ceiling, you're going to have what's called a load rail. Someone has to go up there, and when the scenery or the lighting batten is down on the ground in the stage, the arbor is way up in the air. And so let's say you're going to hang 20 lighting instruments, and each lighting instrument weighs 20 pounds. Yes, that's 400 pounds of weight. 20 times 20 is 400. I think I did the math right. Anyway, and if each of your bricks, each of your counterweights weighs 35 pounds each, that's about 12 bricks. 10 times 35 is 350. 2 times 35 is 70. That's about 420. You got about 400. Like I said, you can get within 20 pounds. If you want to use 11.5, that's fine too. Yes, but within a half brick, you're going to be fine. Anyway, so what you want to do in order to load this system, you're going to have to have someone up in the load rail, and because the way the load rail is free above you, you want to make sure that it's totally safe. And so as you're loading the bricks from the load rail into the arbor, you need to make sure that everyone on stage is aware that what you're doing is very dangerous. Again, you're lifting 35 pounds of weight into the atmosphere and putting it onto a counterweight system. And so the safe way of doing that is when you call up the number of bricks to be loaded on the batten, you say rail, load rail. We need 12 bricks on line set 12. Well, first of all, usually the only thing up there is a line set needs to be loaded. So you don't, as a person who's loading the bricks, you don't really have to worry about which line set it is. It's the one that's up there. Now, occasionally there will be more than one, so you actually have to listen to what specific line set it is. But again, you want to load, you want to make sure that everyone below you is safe and secure. So before you start loading the bricks, you yell down to clear the rail, clear the lock rail, and to clear the floor. And what that means is you need everybody on the floor, on the deck of the theater, to be at least half center line or farther away from you. When you yell down, clear the rail, clear the floor, the person who responds, the rail is clear, the floor is clear, that person's responsibility shifts from whatever they have been doing to making sure that while you're loading upstairs, that anybody who wanders into the building knows that someone is loading and that they are unsafe until they get to the half line, center line, or more. Yes. On the load rail, you often can't move to center. You often move upstage or downstage. Get as far away as you can, because once one of those bricks falls, there's not time for you to think. Again, if anything falls, if keys fall out of your pocket, if a pen falls out of your pocket, anything you drop, the immediate reaction has got to be heads up, or at least heads. And if you're down below on the deck, if you hear anyone from anywhere yell heads, you do not look up. You cover and run as fast as you can away from the sound. Because again, the person who has just dropped the object is the person making the sound. So your response to heads up or heads is to cover and run. Again, a 35-pound brick weight can do a whole lot of damage to you at 16 feet per second squared, yes? Matter of fact, again, not to tell too many stories on myself, but one of the scariest incidents I ever had was where a person was loading a brick, dropped the brick, yelled heads, everybody ran, and the brick never hit the floor. And so everyone realized that somehow the brick had fallen onto another arbor and had stuck there. And so for the next hour, we were slowly but surely climbing up and finding each arbor, and finally we found the free weight and had to get somebody in what's called a bosun's chair to drop down to pick up this weight to bring it to the floor safely. It hasn't happened often, and trust me, when it does happen, it is very scary. But you want to make sure this is not a laughing matter. That can be a death sentence if anybody happens to be hit by a counterweight, as you can imagine. All right, I've got a couple of videos I'm going to show you here. First is just one called Flying Scenery. For those of you who had a hard time imagining what I've been talking about so far, here's a little video that shows you a fly line in use. So you can see the man, he'll unlock the system, he'll fly a piece of a fly batten in and out. Again, one of the things you want to notice is that as he's flying it in and out, you always want to pull on the purchase line down. You don't ever want to lift. You can lift, but again, whatever way the purchase line goes, if you look at the diagram here, if you're trying to bring the batten in, if you pull down on the front line of the purchase line, the arbor will go up, which means the batten is coming down. So whichever way the front line of the purchase line runs, that's the direction the batten is moving. Yes? But if you're trying to get the batten to go up, you always want to pull back down on the back side of the purchase line. You can reach through very easily. All right, so here's a little video about how a fly system works. Enjoy.
Mike Vandercook. I'm the Director of Production here at the Rouse Center.
I'm Lindsay Wolf. I'm the Sound Supervisor here at the Rouse Center.
We've been asked today to take you through a little bit backstage and talk to you about our counterweight system. If you've ever wondered what the giant 7-story fly tower or monolith in downtown Crystal Lake is, that is in fact what it is.
You can see it from pretty much everywhere in the surrounding area, is so that if we have a 25-foot curtain that we want to bring in so that you can see it, we need 25 feet above the proscenium line to be able to hide that so that it can go away.
There's the stage, and then we have curtains, we have movie screens, we've got lighting instruments and everything else that have to go out of the way, back in, and this is how we do it. Everything is on a batten or a large pipe in the sky, and this is our counterweight. You can see it here. So everything that's on a pipe up there weighs a certain amount, so we have to counterbalance that on the other end of the ropes that go all the way across with this giant steel weight here to make sure that it moves smoothly back and forth and doesn't run away. This is your brake. You flip the brake, get it started, and right now I'm going to bring in the movie screen, I believe. Yeah. And then you lock it back off again. When it's time to fly it out, unlock, you pull on the back rope instead and bring the counterweight back down. Right. So if you've got a 700-pound curtain or a 1,200-pound curtain, as long as you have 700 or 1,200 pounds on this end as well, it doesn't take much effort to slide it back and forth. As opposed to trying to do it just manually, which would take 5 or 6 people to try and haul. That's how it works from here.
I know that was darn exciting. Now we talked about loading bricks. So here's a little video on how to load bricks.
Unlock the rope and make sure the weight is high enough or low enough for the person above to unload or load a weight. Relock the rope and go over and get the strap to tighten while the person above reloads or unloads weight. You say, "All clear, ready to unload." The person above either says unlocking or locking weight. When taking off the weight, be sure to do the furthest away from you first, lift up, and then you pull towards, and then lift off altogether. If you have more than one weight, redo that step. When you're done, yell "locking," and the person below you will say "thank you." The person below you will then relock the weight and undo the strap on the rope. Unlock the rope one more time and make sure that the weight is weighted properly.
All right, I know you're happy you got up this morning. All right. Now there are a couple of other things about line sets. One is a lot of times you want to save as much space off stage as you can, so that you can put more scenery, more wagons, more things off stage. And so one of the ways of doing that is by using this thing called mechanical advantage. And what that does is if you add another turn to the rope, and I'll show you what that means in a second. If you add just one more turn to the pulley on the bottom of the arbor, you can double the capacity of the arbor and the batten. Now, this is called a double purchase system. And if you look very closely at the diagram I've got here, at the bottom of the arbor, the hand line goes down to the tension block, goes up to a pulley that has been added to the bottom of the arbor. So there's a little pulley at the bottom of the arbor, and then it goes over that pulley and back down to the ground and tags into the ground. That little pulley, that little thing, if we're using the rope, will double the capacity of the arbor. It also only has to run half as far. So now for every foot of movement on the purchase line, you get 2 foot of movement on stage, which means that you can now lift up the load rail. If you've got, well, here, let's talk about this. Obviously this makes sense, but you may not have thought about it. If you have a 20-foot drop on stage, yes, you've got a 20-foot drop from the floor to the batten. If you're gonna fly it up, out of view, as we talked about before, up is out of view, you need a little bit more than 20 feet because you just don't want it to get to the bottom. You want to get totally out of view. So usually the rule of thumb is 2 times the height of whatever the stage proscenium is how tall your fly house is. So for instance, at the Davis Theater, the proscenium is 18 feet tall. So the grid is at 40 feet, a little bit more than 2 times the height. Again, now you can then stand above the grid, which is where you've hung your head blocks, your loft blocks. And so the ceiling is a good 50 feet above, yes? So that's why fly houses are often stick out on the top, because you need so much more room above the stage in order to have that fly system work. Yes, but again, in the double purchase system, for every foot you travel on stage, you travel half that distance off stage, which allows you to lift the fly rail from the ground into the air and allows you to put that much room underneath the fly rail so that you can then move your scenery. Now, the only downside of all of this is, in order to gain that mechanical advantage that you now have added with the pulley, you have to have twice as much weight in order to balance the system. So before, we talked about the 400-pound lights. Now we need 800 pounds of counterweight in order to balance the amount of weight that's on the arbor. So when you work in a double purchase system, the arbors are twice as big. And a lot of times they will add a second load rail. There'll be a load rail where you work from, but then there'll also be a load rail below that, so that because you have to add so much weight, again, using our example, we've gone from 12 bricks to 24 or 23 and a half bricks in order to balance that system with the same number of weight on stage. It's just that because we're using the double purchase system, we now have to have so much more weight off stage, yes? So again, that is a very nice little remedy that people have found over time to add more fly space and to use the theater more efficiently, so you got more room on the deck. Cool. All right, let's talk about aircraft cable. Aircraft cable was actually invented by the Wright brothers. Yay! It's what they used, steel cable, galvanized steel cable. It has usually got 2 centerpieces and 5 wires that coil around the outside. It can be bought in various sizes. Again, I talk about the thickness of the cable: 1/8-inch cable, 1/4-inch cable, 1/2-inch cable. Again, it's an 1/8-inch thick, a 1/4-inch thick, and a 1/2-inch thick. We typically will use 1/4-inch cable in the theater. 1/4-inch aircraft cable has a breaking strength of 50,000 pounds. What that means is that over time, again, it's sort of a little a graph. There are some times it will break before the average, but a lot of times it will break after the average. But on the curve, most or the majority of times at 50,000 pounds, the aircraft cable broke. Now, we don't necessarily, that's good to know, and 50,000 pounds is a lot of weight. We usually typically work in that kind of dimensions. But we don't ever want to work at the breaking strength of an object. We want to use this thing called a safety factor. The safety factor is what you're going to divide the breaking strength by. It's an arbitrary number. A lot of times in shoddy or cheap constructions, the reason that somebody's bid will come way under somebody else's bid is because they have used a higher or lower safety number. In other words, there was a mall, for instance, in Wichita, Kansas, that built and the snow collapsed the roof on it. And the reason was the people who were constructing the mall had used a safety factor of 3. In other words, if they determined the breaking strength of the ceiling was 30,000 pounds, just because it's easier math, then instead of dividing it by my safety factor, which is 5, in other words, if you divide 30,000 pounds of a breaking strength by 5, you get 6,000 pounds of working strength. Yes? And the working strength, because of all the snow and things that fell onto the roof, They divided by 3, which they had said that this would withhold 10,000 pounds of snow and ice. Well, it had held 8,000 pounds of snow and ice, and then it collapsed, yes? But they were chosen because they had been the low bidder, and the reason they were the low bidder was because they had used a smaller safety factor. So I'm going to tell you, I feel comfortable using a safety factor in everything I do of 5. If somebody tells me this rope's going to break at 100 pounds, I'm going to divide it by 5, and I'm not going to lift more than 20 pounds with it. Again, steel cable breaks at an average of 50,000 pounds. I feel very comfortable dividing by 5 that I'm going to use up to 10,000 pounds. Now, 10,000 pounds is 5 cars. Why would you ever need to fly 5 cars at once? And again, as I described earlier, the batten will divide the weight among the pick lines. So even if you hung for some reason 10,000 pounds, no one pick line is picking up 10,000 pounds. You got the middle one picking up about a quarter of it, yes? And so the outer picks are picking up 10% of it, yes? And so again, you have to, that's why aircraft cable is used, is because it is so much stronger and so much more efficient. Efficiency is a ratio of the weight of an object versus the strength of the object. For instance, I'm going to say that I could lift 200 pounds. I wouldn't be happy, but I think I can lift 200 pounds. Now, I know this is going to come as a shock to all of you. And Matthew, please don't laugh. I weigh a little bit more than 200 pounds. And so my efficiency is low. Whereas my good friend Cody, who's sitting behind you, might not be able to lift it as quickly. He probably could lift it as quickly, but he weighs about half that. So his efficiency is 2, whereas my efficiency is half, let's just say, for grins. So again, efficiency is the relative weight of an object versus the relative strength of an object. Steel tends to be very efficient. It tends to have very strong capacities, but be very lightweight compared to things like wood or other devices that are less efficient. Wood is more efficient than paper, for instance. And so again, different objects require different safety strength. Now, one of the opportunities that you have with aircraft cable is terminating the ends. Aircraft cable can get dicey to end. This is not like a rope where you just tie it off. You have to come up with a way not to crimp the rope. Crimp is a bend in the rope. If you have an aircraft cable and it ever has any kind of crimp, you've taken that safety factor and thrown it out the window. Because a crimp in a safety in an aircraft cable is a weak spot, and just like with anything else, the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. Once you've got a crimp in a rope, a wire rope, you have thrown the safety factor and the working strength out. Because now is that a weak spot, and so you have to be very careful. And so if you ever are working in a line or a flying system and you see a rope that has been crimped, a lot of times the wire may have run off the edge of a pulley and gotten bent around the pin in the pulley and created a little weak spot there. Let somebody know, because that piece of aircraft cable needs to be replaced, because it is now no longer fit to be operated. Yes. Anyway, the standard way of doing that in today's terms is use a Crosby clip. Now, a Crosby clip is made of 3 different devices. There's the saddle, which is the middle part there in the picture that I'm giving you. There's there are the 2 nuts that go around, and then there's the strap that's the other part. The saying is, you never saddle a dead horse. Now, I know that seems obvious, but let me tell you what it means. If you can look at the diagram there where they show you where the 3 Crosby clips are put onto the aircraft cable, the saddle, again, the middle part, the bigger part, is on the live load line. And the strap goes underneath the dead line, and then the nuts are on top. Will it hold the other way? Sure, but not as efficiently. As a matter of fact, if you have the saddle on the dead end, it will tend to slip. Occasionally, I've seen people alternate them and put one way and one the other. That's sort of defeating the purpose, but it's better than having them all facing the wrong way. Anyway, you want to, depending upon how much weight you're going to have, Crosby clips are rated just like the wire is rated at different safety strengths or different working strengths, different breaking strengths. In 1/4-inch cable, I have found the Crosby clip is rated at 5,000 pounds, which again, if I divide by 5, is 1,000 pounds of breaking strength. And because I will never use that much weight on a batten, I feel comfortable with only having 2 Crosbys. Again, that gives you 2,000 pounds of working strength. Some people feel that you have to have 3 Crosbys. Again, it's better to be extra safe than to have an accident happen. Now, again, because the crimp would be a bad thing, there are these devices called thimbles. You can see there's a nice little shiny thimble there, and it goes around right at the end of the termination of the aircraft cable. And that's a way of keeping the end of the aircraft cable from crimping. The other way to terminate aircraft cable is to use what's called a NicoPress sleeve. Now, the nice thing about a NicoPress sleeve is that you just slip it on, and then you take a NicoPress and you press it, and it crimps down on the NicoPress and holds it in place. Now, I want to tell you, the picture that's there does not have a thimble in it. That is not a correct way to do it, but I couldn't find a picture of a NicoPress that had a correct thimble. So hey, there you go, you learn. Anyway, but that's the way that aircraft cable, again, there's usually on a 30-foot batten, there'll be 5 line sets. Again, these will be made out of aircraft cable. The purchase line, because aircraft cable can be can harm your hands very quickly, the purchase line is almost always manila rope, especially nowadays. Cotton fiber sometimes. Again, you have to be kind of careful depending on the purchase line a lot of times. So if you've had a bidding war, which most public institutions have, you may find yourself with the purchase line being made out of nylon. The problem with nylon rope has a very high breaking strength. The problem with nylon rope, though, is it will stretch a lot before it breaks. So you have to be very careful, because when you talk about manila rope, it's more expensive because it's harder to make and maintain. But once you have that manila rope, it doesn't stretch. It'll sag, especially if there's a high humidity, but it doesn't stretch. But that's why that tension block's at the bottom, because the tension block has about a 2-foot span at the bottom, and as you add more moisture to the air, the manila rope may sag a little bit, and the tension block will pick up that little bit of sag. And again, it's also very easy to retie a purchase line if for some reason there's a lot of sag in the system. Cool, hopefully that makes sense for how a line set system works. We're going to move on to rigging. Arena rigging is something that happens at indoor concert venues, things that aren't typically set up to be a stage, like a coliseum or like a ballroom, where you want to add lights and sound that go along with the concert or whatever's happening on the stage, speech from a politician, that sort of stuff. First of all, there are 2 types of riggers. People who do the rigging are called riggers. There's an up rigger and a down rigger. They have very distinct jobs. An up rigger has got to have nerves of steel. There's a picture of what it looks like if you're an up rigger. You are hanging out above the crowd, above the audience, sometimes 75, 80 feet, and there ain't nothing between you and the floor, except air, and that'll do you a lot of good to breathe on the way down, I guess, so you're fine. There has been a movement in the past 20 years to add more and more safety cabling for upriggers, but I can promise you, for instance, if you're ever at the Garrett Coliseum, it has been what's called grandfathered in. In other words, it was built before the regulations, modern regulations. There are no safety cables on Garrett Coliseum. You are up there on a beam. The beam is literally about a foot wide, you hope. And you trust me, when I'm up there in an uprigger, first of all, I'm not going to be an uprigger. I hopefully attain a level of respect. In other words, I've gained too much weight. And I'm not going to go back up there. But when I was an uprigger, I would clean the bar, as they would say. I would hold on to dear life to that thing. But there are steel walkers that are very accustomed to walking around up there, and they're footloose and fancy free, more power to them. But that uprigger will take a rope with them, and they will drop that rope down, and the downrigger will attach what is called a basket. A basket is a piece of steel that is going to go around the beam up top, and you're going to create what's called a point. Usually, if you have a truss is a long metal cage. Again, it can be triangular, it can be a square. but you'll have some sort of truss that you're going to hang, and then from that hangs the lighting and sound instruments. Again, all this is weighted and rated so that you don't put too much weight on any one point. Sometimes you'll have just 2 points because the truss only needs 2 points to pick up. Sometimes you'll have 3 or 4 points because the weight that's being put onto the truss exceeds the weight limit of the motors and or the steel that's holding it in the air. Again, upriggers do these calculations. I'm not trying to make you an uprigger or a downrigger, I'm just trying to explain the process. So you're an uprigger, you've dropped your rope down, you have the downrigger attach a basket, a piece of burlap, and the chain motor or a stinger. A stinger is a piece of steel that hangs down from the basket that connects to the chain motor. Chain motor is a device that has a piece of chain that goes through, and the motor works itself up the chain, and that's what you attach to the truss so that you can raise it up into the air. But the first thing that has to happen is you find your points, you make your notations about where the points in the uprigger goes up. He finds the location on the beam that is closest to that. He will drop down a rope to attach the basket, the stinger if you need one, and or attach the chain motor, have them lift it up. This is where you need to learn to tie a bowline. We're not going to learn that in this class, but a bowline is a very nice knot. It's about a 2-foot knot, but that holds together very strongly, but it also unties very quickly. In the diagram you see there, one of the problems is they don't have a piece of burlap on that point. I have no idea why, but one of the things about steel cable is the steel cable is used to cut marble. They don't have, that's the saw blade if you're cutting marble or if you're cutting rock. Over time, if you have a concert, a very loud concert, rock and roll concert, and the steel cable starts shifting slightly, it will cut through the steel beam. And again, if you cut through a steel beam, you weaken the beam. So for whatever reason, if you put a piece of burlap sack, a potato sack, underneath that little basket, it will contain and stop the aircraft cable from moving. Again, they don't have it shown there in the diagram, but that's a very important safety feature factor in doing that. It may just be a southern thing, I'm not really sure, but I know it works, that's for sure. Anyway, that flies down to the motor, which is then attached to the truss. Now, I've also got shown here what's called a rigging from the floor. You can have ground support, in other words, you have winches that are just raised by hand cranks. Those can be, if you're outdoor theater, that sort of thing, you've almost always got to use ground support because there's nothing above you. So again, this is where lights like park cans come in handy because again, when you're working outdoors in wind and rain and elements, those lights, because they're self-contained, as we looked at earlier, they don't allow water to leak into the light. Again, here's a little picture of some motors hanging from above. Motors are rated. Again, some motors will raise 250 pounds. They're very small little motors. Some motors are rated at 4 tons. Again, the steel cable with the safety factor is 5 tons or 10 tons. Yes, or 5 tons is 10,000 pounds. But again, in arena rigging, you're usually using 3/8 inch cable. So there's an example of a shackle and a piece of aircraft cable, which is, again, in rigging, they typically will call that the steel. So you have a box that has the steel in it. They come in different lengths, 5 foot, 10 foot, 15 foot, 25 foot. And so you have to figure out your points and how far down, if the chain motor, for instance, is 25 feet and you're 60 feet in the air, you may need to drop a stinger down 35 feet in order to pick up the chain motor. Now, the rig, the truss, will only fly up as much as the chain is on the chain motor. So most chain motors that I work with are 70, 80 feet. Yes. Now, again, the weight you're talking about with a chain that is 75, 80 feet long is enormous. Yes. There's a little basket that's attached to the chain motor. And again, in the video we're about to watch, I'll talk about if the chain starts to run, I'll call heads. It's a very scary thing when chain starts falling from the ceiling, that's for sure, or any of this stuff, yes? All right, so here's a little video, a little cartoon video that, again, is not an in-depth explanation of arena rigging, but hopefully will reinforce what I've just described to you, and if you're clueless as to what I've just described to you, hopefully it'll get you to the point where you understand what arena rigging is. Enjoy.
This video will be about the basics of rigging. It is always an interesting feat to see how it is done. I will give you a quick explanation how. A lot of people go see concerts and they see a large lighting rig in the air and don't understand how it got there. It's quite simple in theory. What happens at the beginning of any load-in for a concert venue is that the rigger will climb up to the steel structure of the building. They take an elevator or a ladder to get to the catwalk. Down here is where the truss gets built. The rigger will be up here. He will look at the structure of the beams and know what they are rated for. 500-pound load, 1,000-pound load, 2,000-pound load, or whatever it may be. It takes two riggers to get the job done. The guy in the air and the ground rigger. The ground rigger has a tough job because if this guy drops anything, it could knock him on the head. The ground worker is always wearing a hard hat and is responsible for the other workers in the area to say, "Hey, there's a guy above working, don't come near me." This rigger will tie off a rope and drop it all the way to the ground. The rigger will assemble his span sets and wire ropes and whatever he needs. 5-footers, 10-footers, 20-footers, and attach them to the bottom of the rope. This guy will pull everything up. Now he has all his stuff so he can securely build what is called a point. A concert rig can have 100 points. Some will have 6. Depends on the size of the venue, size of the lighting rig, size of the trussing rig. Now down here, the ground rigger has what is called a chain motor or a hoist. He prepares the motor. Everything requires power. There will be a motor distro attached to power. The rigger will again drop his rope to the ground. The ground rigger will attach that rope to the end of the chain. This motor will have, let's say, 75 feet of chain, which is heavy. This rigger will pull that chain and its hook all the way up. Now you can imagine this is hard work. They are pulling a lot of chain and they can't drop it. The chain comes up and they hook it into the point they built. Now that's hooked in. This motor has a hook underneath it as well. Now we plug that motor in, turn it on, and hit the up button. Every once in a while you'll hear a ground rigger yell, "Chain spill!" Chain gathered up too much and has fallen out of the basket and will come whipping out down to the ground. You don't want a chain falling. Now here is our truss. We attach this motor to the truss, and we also have another one here to attach to the truss with a chain going up to the point. This rig has 2 points, which means there's 2 places where the rigger has created a point to drop a rope to bring up a chain. Now you have these motors plugged into power. You turn it on and these motors start climbing. Now we can attach the lights. They lift the truss to about waist height or head height while it's on the ground here, and the lighting crew comes in and attaches all the fixtures and gives it the okay. The rigger will say, "Truss moving," and the truss starts moving wherever it will live for the show. And during the loadout, the process is the same, just in reverse. That is rigging in its basic form.
All right, so those are basic ways of flying lighting systems in the air. Again, one of the things we're going to talk about in a couple weeks is sound. Not that you are a sound designer, but because it also uses electricity, one of the things that happens in a lot of theatrical events, a lot of theatrical places, they assume that the lighting designer knows sound. And so we're going to spend at least a lecture on sound so that you're not totally unfamiliar with the concepts. But we'll talk more about that then. See y'all later.